I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this week's podcast. This episode I'm talking about one of the fundamental cornerstones that underpins everything we do as growers, soil. And to talk about this vital element, who better than soil scientist and international expert on the subject, Tim O'Hare. Tim is the principal consultant of Tim O'Hare Associates. He and his team work on a wide variety of domestic and commercial projects throughout the UK and internationally, including the London Olympic Park and the Commonwealth Park in Gibraltar. They also test and approve many of the topsoil and subsoil products that are sold into the landscape market nationwide. In recognition of his work, Tim was awarded an honorary fellowship by the Kew Guild for his outstanding contribution to the environment earlier this year. I was delighted when Tim agreed to come on the podcast, and I hope you enjoy listening to this interview as much as I enjoyed recording it. Obviously, you work on large-scale commercial projects, but presumably the problems that you come across can be similar to those faced by gardeners, regardless of the size of their plot. So when a site's being redesigned or is established from scratch, are there any particular mistakes that you see repeated time and again that cause damage to the soil?
Yeah, you're right. And certainly in the first instance, small scale, large scale, it doesn't really matter what the size is. The problems manifest themselves on all schemes, really. I suppose the first thing that springs to mind is that I suppose one of the big mistakes is that people don't actually understand what soils they've got on the site. Little or no investigation or assessment by themselves or whoever is undertaken. So if you're not aware of the type of soil you've got, whether it's acid or alkaline, or whether it's a sandy soil, silty soil, clay soil, how deep is it? Have you got 100 mil of topsoil or have you got 400 mil of topsoil? All those sort of factors sort of need to be thought out at the very beginning, really, because that firstly gives you a better understanding of what you can and can't do with the soils on the site, but also steers you towards plant selection, species selection, and sort of the need or considerations for drainage and all those sorts of things. So I suppose that's one of the big mistakes. We often get invited to projects when it's all been constructed and they've got serious problems of drainage or certain plants aren't happy in the soils, and it's sort of, you track back from that, you think, well, if they've made certain decisions at the beginning of the project based on some baseline information, they could have avoided all those issues. But yeah, in terms of sort of what causes damage to the soil, I mean, at any process which interrupts the soil, so it's the contractors turning up and parking their equipment on site, storing materials on site, anything when you dig up the soil and move it around, anything like that will cause compaction to a greater or lesser extent, and that's probably the biggest issue on certainly constructing new landscape schemes when you've had a lot of construction activity around. So there's a house there as well, and usually the sort of closer to the house, the worse the compaction is, and often closer to the house is where the most expensive plants are put in, and that's where the problems arise. I think the other thing is that although people, developers and contractors recognise they have to strip the topsoil, pull it back, and stockpile it before they start, putting foundations in and everything else, sometimes very little thought is put into actually stripping the topsoil back. Do you take the vegetation off it first, or do you keep the vegetation in? Where are you going to store it? Have you actually got space to store it? And if you have got space to store it, where is it going to get in the way later on? And people are going to have to move it once, twice, three times. I mean, sometimes we see little heaps everywhere because the contractor's just pulled it back from where he wants to start doing some groundwork, but doesn't actually think about collecting it all up and putting it in a nice big heap. And I mean, with topsoil stockpiling, the conception often is we'll strip the grass with it or the vegetation with it, because that will rot down in the stockpile and it'll make a better soil. I have to say that is the worst thing you can do. Very, very often a massive vegetation going into the stockpile makes the whole thing very, very anaerobic. And when you come to reuse that soil, you firstly got to reoxygenate it, which takes longer. But also the vegetation doesn't rot down as people perceive, unless you're going to leave it there for 5, 6, 7 years. In fact, what you end up with is great big clumps of smelly, rotting, anaerobic clods of grass and so on. So often it's best to sort of certainly minimise the amount of vegetation. It doesn't mean to say take it all off, but sometimes minimise it. If you've got a very long, tall grass, then maybe mow it and take off the cuttings before you put it in. So yeah, I suppose those are sort of examples of lack of thought to managing the soil resource that you've got on a site. I mean, this day and age, we're trying to protect our soils and reuse them as much as possible for environmental reasons as well as obviously commercial reasons. And a little bit of more thought at the front end of projects can go a long way to doing that.
Mm. So you mentioned compaction being quite a common problem. So is it the case that if you have soil compaction, then that could actually cause you problems with flooding?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the soil profile is the biggest sort of water attenuation body we have. And say, for example, an undisturbed field has a sort of 300 mil of topsoil, and then probably the subsoil can go down another sort of 600 mil, 700 mil. That is the main body in the soil profile which attenuates most of the rainfall. So on a construction site, which is then obviously turned into a house or a commercial development or whatever, you've taken away some of that ability because you've put a building on it. So that land has got less ability to attenuate water. So whatever's left behind, i.e. the soft landscape scheme afterwards, has an even more important role of absorbing rainwater. And typically we often see that, the topsoil's been stripped off or it's not there to start with. So the subsoils basically are used as a construction site. And so they're heavily compacted by, as I said, materials, trafficking and everything else. And very often when the landscape is reinstated, that subsoil layer is not decompacted. And the topsoil's literally just pushed over it. I mean, we see this time and time again, the topsoil's pushed back over it. And the topsoil's light and fluffy and nice, and the plants can go into it. But that soil profile has not been reinstated to what it was beforehand. And it's lost the ability. So say you had 900 mil of topsoil and then subsoil in total. You've now got, say, 150 or 300 mil of attenuation potential in the topsoil. But the subsoil's lost it. And so where does that water go? The water will fill up the topsoil. And then where does it go? It basically runs off the site. Flooding on a micro scale, i.e. somebody's back garden, can be translated into a whole housing estate or a whole river catchment and nationwide. And it's one of the biggest issues of poor soil management in the construction industry as a whole, which contributes to flooding. So we really have got to, as part of all of our processes, make sure we get the subsoil layer to function properly and give it the ability to drain. Because not only will it obviously improve water attenuation and reduce flood risk, but the plants will grow a lot better and perform a lot better without water inputs and all that sort of thing.
If you've got soil compaction in your subsoil, then presumably you're going to find that your plants might be, sitting a lot wetter than they were before you did any work. But what are some of the other reasons that you might find a really high moisture content in the soil? I know that is a problem for gardeners, and I wondered what some of the more common reasons for it are.
Sure. I mean, 50% of the soils in this country, natural soils in this country, are dominated by clay. So they're what we call heavily textured, moisture retentive soils, which for the summertime is a very good thing. We want that water there to supply the plants. But come winter time, it's more water retentive, and I think it's heavy clay and heavy silt soils are slowly permeable, so the water doesn't move through them very quickly. So if you've got high levels of input of water, i.e. lots of rainfall over our winter period, or typically over a winter period, the water backs up. It doesn't drain quickly enough to go down through the soil profile. But the other things that affect moisture levels in the soils are things like the hydrology of the site. I was just speaking to somebody this morning who's on a garden where the garden slopes, and obviously the top of the garden is nice and dry, but the bottom is consistently wet. And that's a perfectly natural thing. Water goes from high to low, and we have to cater for that. So in this instance, she's selecting a plant species, a palette of species, which will tolerate moisture-retentive, heavy, wet soils, which is perfect. So hydrology, that's affecting surface water runoff. And then, of course, you have groundwater. Some sites have a very high groundwater table. And so the water, not coming from above, but just from below, regardless of rainfall, comes up and saturates the ground from below. So in terms of remedying the problems, well, one of the most important things is on sites where the soils have been disturbed is decompacting that soil layer. If you open the soil up and create lots of fissures and cracks, then the soil will have a much greater ability to absorb the water that's there and hold on to it. Other options are sometimes when people want to do tree planting or shrub planting in wet areas is to slightly raise the planting beds or raise the tree planting area. So if you're planting one individual tree, you can mound it up slightly, or if it's a group of trees, have them all mounded slightly, just to, no more than say 300 or 400 mil above the surrounding ground, because it just lifts at least a proportion of the root ball above the very wet ground. And it's a very cheap and cheerful way of doing it. You don't have to bother with land drains and other ways of getting rid of the water. The water's allowed to stay there, but the trees are sitting just above it. That's a technique that's been used for hundreds of years. It's not nothing new, but I think it's something that designers forget about sometimes, and it's a perfectly good way of doing it. Obviously, land drainage is another way of removing surplus water. And again, some drainage designs I see are very good and efficient, and others are terrible. They don't actually. They really only end up with a very short lifespan. The use of geotextile in drainage systems is one of the big problems, because we find time and time again the geotextiles clog up with the soil fines, and then they become useless, basically. The other big thing, if you're going to think about drainage, is you've got to take the water somewhere. It's no point putting lots of expensive drains in, backfilling them with gravel if there's nowhere for it to go. Now, often people think, well, we'll put a soakaway in. That's perfectly good. That's a really good option, provided your ground offers soakage. We see a lot of soakaways which are not soakaways, they're sumps, because the water's drained into them and it doesn't drain out the bottom end, because the whole site is on clay, for example, and therefore that's not an option. The other option that is not really available these days is draining into the surface water sewer system. Most water companies these days will not allow any land drainage to discharge into the sewers, because they're basically saying they're full, they're at capacity, and they can't take any more. The halfway house of that is to put in a soakaway layer, or one of these crate systems, which will take most of the water. But if it does overflow and it fills up, then there's an overflow to tip into the sewer system or into a ditch or something like that. That is more accepted by water companies these days.
So going back to what you were saying, I was thinking about the mismanagement of soil actually when works are being done. I'm assuming that it is desirable to preserve the macro and microorganisms that are in the soil. But if we did cause any problems that caused them to, be destroyed in any way, how could we get them back?
I think, certainly the microorganisms usually aren't destroyed by sort of soil disturbance. They're there. Even when you put topsoil into a stockpile and it goes anaerobic, basically that process, the normal aerobic bacteria become dormant effectively, and some die off, and they're taken over by anaerobic bacteria, which have been sat there in a sort of dormant state. But when that topsoil's re-spread and re-aerated, usually the normal microbes will come back in, or they'll sort of wake up again. So it's not a permanent means of damaging that. So microorganisms generally, if they're there to start with, they will be there again. Things like earthworms, the bigger stuff, yes, unfortunately they do get destroyed by sort of earth-moving processes. But generally, soils are full of earthworm eggs, and so they will obviously hatch and recover, and the population will then expand from there on. I often get asked, a lot of the soils we use these days are what we call manufactured topsoils, so they're made using sort of mineral overburden materials, subsoil materials, which is then blended with compost. Compost has a multitude of microorganisms, fungi, bacteria, protozoa, and so on. So those soils are automatically inoculated with microorganisms straight away. And obviously, if you add a compost or a manure to an existing topsoil, then again you're inoculating it with the microbes as well. But I mean, interesting. So people say, well, what do we need to introduce earthworms and the like into these manufactured soils, because they don't obviously have any earthworm eggs? And I've seen a few schemes where people have tried it, and it hasn't worked. Generally, earthworms will, when you've created a brand new soil after construction works, the soil's not really in a good state to be able to receive a load of earthworms. There's not enough oxygen. There's probably a lot of compaction and so on. And they don't really establish very well. I mean, on the Olympic Park, all the soils that we designed for the Olympic Park, there's 7 different types, were all manufactured soils. So there was no earthworms in them when they arrived. But I've been back on several occasions since then, and the earthworm population is thriving now. And so you think, well, where have they come from if they haven't been introduced by us? And actually, if you think about it, all the trees that have been planted on the Olympic Park came from nurseries, and the root balls obviously were the natural soils from the nurseries. So when you're planting anything which is being field grown and has a root ball, for example, then that will have its own population of macro and microorganisms. Things like mycorrhizae fungi will be in there as well, and if the conditions outside of the root balls are right for the organisms, then they will quickly expand and migrate. So root balls are a fantastic mechanism for introducing earthworms and other macroorganisms.
I guess it's like when you empty a pond and you keep a little bit of the water back, it's just repopulating it with all the living stuff, and it doesn't take long to colonise.
Exactly, yeah.
So you were talking about the manufactured soils. If you were importing new soil, where would that come from? And are there environmental implications of importing and exporting soil across sites?
In terms of environmental implications, I mean, clearly moving soils from one place to another is burning diesel in lorries, doing all the sort of environmental impact stuff that we're aware of. So, the principles are you try and minimise how much soil you move from one place to another. It's far better to try and reuse what you've got. In terms of where soils come from, well, really there's 3. The topsoil industry, if you like, has 3 main sources. You have natural topsoil. So if somebody's developing a greenfield site, and they only need half of the soil to be reused again, which is pretty typical, even only a third maybe. That surplus topsoil is taken off-site by haulage contractors and soil companies, and they either supply it directly to other projects, or they take it back to a yard and stockpile it and then sell it on later on. So there's natural topsoil. We have our dear friends, the sort of skip waste companies and demolition companies. They offer a slightly different soil. It can be called screen soil or screen muck away or recycled soils. And basically, this is the fines that are left over after they've screened what's coming in a skip. So the skip may contain brick rubble, some topsoil, subsoil, some window panes, whatever, tarmac chippings and stuff. And it goes through a 10mm screen at the recycling yard. And the coarse aggregate that's recovered is obviously sold as recycled aggregate, which is great. But the fines that have come through the screener, they are miraculously somehow turned into topsoil. And it's not topsoil. It's clearly not. Sometimes it looks like topsoil, but it's not. It doesn't have all the properties of topsoil. And as I said, it can be laced with glass and ceramic shards from tiles and stuff. It can have contaminants in it. I mean, obviously tarmac and ash and clinker, things like that, have contaminants, heavy metals and hydrocarbons. So there's the screen muckaway soils, usually the cheaper stuff, and it really has least potential. Certainly not in domestic gardens or schools, play areas, or high performance, high demand landscaping schemes. That sort of soil is not suitable. So the third option is the manufactured soils, which are, we've been playing around with them for almost 20 years now. Blue Water Park, the big shopping centre in Dartford in Kent, that was all manufactured topsoil. That was the first one we had a go at it on, and we made about 60,000 cube of soil for that. But many companies are doing it. You can buy manufactured soil now, sort of nationwide, really. And if the components are good, so normally, as I said, it's a subsoil. A sandy subsoil is mixed with a compost to make sort of a soil substitute, a topsoil substitute. That should usually work. I mean, people do try using other things, silt bed washings. Construction demolition waste is used instead of subsoil, and you can have some very bad manufactured soils out there. So those are the real three sources. And my advice is to, whatever soil you're going to bring in, make sure that your supplier can give you up-to-date, accurate, independent analysis that confirms that the soil's fit for purpose.
So how would you know you weren't importing any horrible, nasty weeds in? If you're importing natural topsoil, then you've definitely got a weed seed bank. You don't necessarily know. If you can visually identify things like rhizomes, things like bindweed and couch grass, you can visibly see it. But weed seeds, you just don't have a clue. And you should assume there's certainly a weed seed bank there. Things like Japanese knotweed are very difficult to, mare's tail, things like that, it's very difficult to see them in the soil. So you've got to ask the supplier about the source of the soil, where's it come from, and they should be able to confirm that it's free of those sorts of weeds. Manufactured soils, again, if they're using good quality compost and the base material they're mixing with is a subsoil or an inert material, then it shouldn't have any sort of weed seed bank at all. So manufactured soils generally are weed free. Yeah. Okay. So you were talking as well about contamination of soils. What are some of the more common things that soils might be contaminated with?
Well, I suppose there's three elements to that. Most of the time we test for things like heavy metals, so arsenic, cadmium, chromium, lead, mercury, things like that, and also a range of hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons are particularly problematic because a lot of them are carcinogenic, so we try and minimise human exposure to them. I mean, they don't harm plants at all. I mean, hydrocarbon is another form of organic matter, so it's not a problem. But there's some certain nasty ones out there which we try and avoid. And then things like asbestos as well is prevalent in the soil. The buildings which were made with asbestos, a lot of them are being demolished. And although a lot of them have contractors to remove asbestos, a lot of them in the past didn't. So you get asbestos fibres flying all over the place. So it's worth checking the soils for that as well. So those are sort of contaminants which I would say affect human health. But then you've also got contaminants that affect plant health. And so some of the heavy metals, copper, nickel and zinc, those are deemed to be toxic to plants at relatively low concentrations. But you've also got a contaminant, if you like, is an excess of alkalinity. Say the soil's got a lot of brick mortar or crushed concrete in it, then the pH of the soil will be extremely high. It could be up to 9, 10, 11. That in itself is effectively a toxic situation for plants that don't tolerate that level. Another source of contaminants is excess salts or high salinity in the soil. That will affect the ability for plant roots to take up water. So either road salt, things like that, or an excess of fertilizer, or a compost, too much compost, or a compost which is too salty. Those can cause contaminants. And then I think the third one I've touched on is physical contaminants, things that will cause harm or injury to people. And we're primarily talking about glass, shards of glass, or, as I said, ceramic tile, or nails, anything that really. And I mean, you'd be surprised. I mean, I've looked at some schemes the last couple of years where large quantities of this screened topsoil, muck-away topsoil, has been brought in. And initially, visually, it looks fantastic. Nice brown, friable, workable soil. But as soon as it gets a bit of rain on it and the soil particles are washed off the stony material, and you see the glass and all the other sharps popping up all over the place, it really is, not only a high risk to end users. You can't spread it on a garden lawn, for example, but it's more common than people would imagine. So people should be vigilant for that sort of thing.
Yes, I've found all sorts of things when I've been digging in gardens. I'm sure most people have dug up a greenhouse in their time, but I found a horse's tooth the other day, which was novel. So I'm sure you found some strange things as well in your time. But can you maybe talk about one or two interesting projects that you've been involved with, or where you've had, particularly interesting challenges, or where the soil had to perform an unusual function, for example?
Sure. I suppose one of the projects we've had a long-term involvement with is Jubilee Gardens, which is the park right next to the London Eye in central London. That was restored to a new park, obviously for the Jubilee, and I think at the moment the visitor numbers are reported to be about, I think, 8.5-9 million a year. So we knew they. I mean, I think when we originally did all the specifications for the soils there, we were told it was about 3.5 million was the visitor numbers. So that was still enough to warrant using very specific soils to make sure they could deal with the pressure on them. So the gardens have it's predominantly laid to lawn, the soft areas, but there's also about just over 100 trees planted as well. So we worked on the basis of two main soil types, where one was for the trees, like a general sort of planting topsoil for the trees and shrub beds as well. And they've all done tremendously well, and we're really pleased with that. But I suppose the focus I've got on is the lawn areas, which have to take a huge amount of foot trafficking and therefore compaction. So for those, we did use a very engineered soil, pretty much on the same principles as a golf green would be, except we didn't use golf greens. Generally use peat as their organic component. We don't like to use that, so we use green compost as the organic component. And yeah, those soils have performed tremendously well. They're not without high maintenance. With that many visitors, the maintenance for the project is extremely intense. We do aeration and decompaction all the time, and it does get fed obviously as well and irrigated. But it's phenomenal how good the grass looks and how much it puts up with the wear and tear. And it's purely down to partly down to the composition of the soil, which was, as I said, a really high performance root zone. So yeah, that's one project which we oversee and advise on the maintenance of it year on year. So we go back and test for compaction and test for fertility and so on, and then advise on the forthcoming year's maintenance for that. Another project, probably a little bit further afield, but a nice one to talk about, is one we did in Gibraltar a few years ago with Mark Gregory from Landform Consultants and in turf with the turf suppliers. So Gibraltar everyone perceives it to be a great big rock, which it is. There's very little sort of flat ground, but they have reclaimed land from the sea over hundreds of years. And the government wanted to build a park. There's no park, no sort of public open space in Gibraltar, apart from the Botanic Gardens. So they wanted to put a new park in there. So what was actually previously reclaimed land from the sea, and most recently it was a car park, that was all pulled off. And we oversaw the manufacture of topsoil to make all the soil there. So we used clay arisings from local ground excavations and construction projects. We imported manures from Spain and sand and stuff from various areas, and the soils there are all manufactured, but do tremendously well. I think it's probably, certainly the clay-based topsoil is probably the best topsoil I think we've ever sort of made, because it, as you said, clay soils are very good if they're dry and manageable, and obviously with the climate over there, it was easy to make the soil and handle it. But the plants, I've been back this year, and the plants are doing tremendously well. The trees have put on huge growth. Everything's looking healthy, and I suppose most importantly, all the public in Gibraltar absolutely love it. The park is full all the time, and it's a great amenity space.
Yeah, I saw pictures of that when it was still a car park, and it is phenomenal. The transformation is amazing. So before I let you go, I know it is a little bit off topic, but it is a concern, I think, for a lot of people. We get a lot of things on social media where people will say, there's only 40 harvests left in our soil, or whatever the number is. So we do think, I hear that the topsoil is being lost, it's being eroded, and that if that happens, obviously that's going to have an effect on our ability to feed ourselves, and that seems to be a global problem. So is that something that we, in your opinion, should be taken seriously, and can we do anything to stop it?
Really good question. Yes, it is. There is a global threat, and certainly a national threat as well. It is serious. Our soils have been under decline for many, many years. As a nation, as a sort of national coverage, we're talking mostly about agricultural land here, and particularly arable agriculture, where there's not a permanent cover of vegetation. And really the quality of the soils have diminished over the years, partly because in the old days farmers were very much mixed farmers, and the manures and stuff from the cattle or sheep would go back onto the land, and farming fields would be rotated between pasture and arable. And that sort of system is deteriorated really, and we're now into sort of big commercial farms which are focused purely on agriculture, and farmers have relied on chemical fertilizers rather than organic manures and so on. So over the years, organic matter levels and carbon levels in the soils have deteriorated. Microbial activity and macroorganism populations have diminished. So there's been a steady decline, not just in sort of loss from erosion, but loss in soil health as well, and therefore soil function. And whilst the government and lots of agencies are now sort of going back to trying to create biodiverse habitats on field margins and so on with wildflowers and so on, we've got to do a lot more. And there's a body called the Sustainable Soils Alliance, which is now actively talking to government and encouraging lots of companies and other organisations to really look at this. And interesting, we're running a conference on the 26th of September, which Neville Fay, the chair of the Sustainable Soil Alliance, is talking. And really, part of my focus at the conference is to actually focus on what the landscape industry as a whole can do to contribute to that. We can't actively do much about farmland because we're not involved with it. But as I've said all along, we don't leave soils in a very good state after we've had them on construction sites or even new garden construction projects. And I think if we all did our bit to try and make sure, subsoils are decompacted, soils are working as efficient as they can, we're trying to promote biodiverse habitats rather than sort of monocultures, all those sorts of things will help with it. Soil erosion, yes, is a big problem. And from a farming community, yes, they've got to make sure they sort of come up with there's lots of measures. There's lots of good practice out there that they could follow to do that. From our perspective, when we stockpile soils, we should ensure that they're not going to get suffered by lots of erosion. They can be protected and so on. But generally, I think we just got to make sure the soils work as efficiently as possible to deal with all these things, including the flooding as well.
So we've all got to play our part, definitely.
Yeah. Good soil management, good soil preparation will do a lot to help that.
We are indeed all responsible to a greater or lesser degree for respecting and caring for our natural resources, no matter whether we design gardens, tend an allotment, build a patio, or dig a flower bed. I'd like to thank Tim for agreeing to the interview. He's involved in some huge projects, and so I very much appreciate that he took the time to share his knowledge with us. If you don't follow me on social media, you probably won't know that Roots and All has been shortlisted for the Garden Media Guild Radio Broadcast/Podcast of the Year award. There are 4 other podcasts and radio shows on the shortlist, and they're created by large organisations and fronted by professional media personalities, so I'm delighted and honoured to have made it to the shortlist. And I wouldn't have done that without my wonderful guests, and it would be meaningless if it weren't for you listening. So thanks for doing so, and I'll catch you next Tuesday. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps, and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.